Alright, history buffs, buckle up. Tonight, we're taking a stroll down the back alleys of the ancient world's most powerful city. We're pulling back the curtain on a topic that was everywhere in ancient Rome but has been politely edited out of your history books. We're diving into the surprisingly well-documented and often wildly misunderstood daily life of Roman prostitutes. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, you know the drill. If you enjoy what we do here, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And I always love to know who I'm talking to, so drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's genuinely awesome to see our global community of history nerds connecting. Okay, enough housekeeping. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's get ready for our journey. Imagine you wake up, or, to be more accurate, you regain consciousness. The space you're in is barely large enough to turn around without elbowing a wall. Congratulations, you're a working woman in ancient Rome, and you live in what's generously called a cella, the Roman version of a work-from-home setup. If your home was a glorified broom closet and your job required a lot of body oil and a high tolerance for disappointment, these rooms were standard issue for many of Rome's prostitutes, usually located in a brothel, a lupanaria, or stacked like human filing cabinets above the local tavern or bathhouse. Think of it as a studio apartment designed by someone who passionately hates light, fresh air, and the concept of personal space. Your mattress is stuffed with straw, which you share with a thriving community of fleas, and it smells faintly of spilled wine, old smoke, and shattered dreams. Is there a light? Maybe, if you're lucky, there's a small sputtering oil lamp. If you're really lucky, it hasn't been stolen by your last client. Your few worldly possessions, some cheap chalky makeup, a worn-out comb, maybe a polished bronze mirror if business has been good, are shoved into corner looking as tired of being there as you are. And let's talk about plumbing. Just kidding, there isn't any. There's no running water. There's a bucket in the corner that you try your absolute best not to think about. What about bathing? Oh, that's a group activity you'll get to later at the nearest public bathhouse, where the water is communal, the philosophical debates are loud, and the awkward eye contact is absolutely free. But there's no time to lounge around thinking about your sad little bucket, because your bedroom is also your office, and business hours are literally whenever someone knocks, barges in, or just yells your name through the thin wooden door. Privacy, you see, is a modern luxury. In ancient Rome, walls were merely suggestions and doors were mostly for decoration. Most days begin not with a gentle awakening, but with a frantic cleanup. You have to sweep out yesterday's dust, wine stains, and the occasional lost sandal left behind by a visitor who was in too much of a hurry to notice. Then comes the prep work. This isn't about looking beautiful, it's about looking available. You apply a layer of face powder, a smear of rouge, and enough cheap perfume to be considered a fire hazard. You're not trying to smell good, you're trying to smell better than the open sewer drain just down the street. You might practice a sultry half smile in your bronze mirror, not because you think it works, but because pretending is part of the job description. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you're still riding the emotional high from that compliment a week later. Because here, in the cramped, airless cellar, every single day begins exactly the same, rushed, undignified, and filled with just enough hope to make it to lunchtime. After waking up in your glorified broom closet, it's time to tackle hygiene, or what passed for it in ancient Rome. As we've established, there's no private bathroom. That kind of luxury is reserved for the wealthy, and even their plumbing was basically just pots with ambition. As a working girl in a city that worships marble statues but tolerates open sewers, your best bet is the nearest public fountain or, if you can afford it, the public baths. If you're pressed for time, which you almost always are, you opt for a quick splash and dash at the communal fountain. You splash some water on your face, maybe rinse your mouth out with wine if you're feeling fancy, and just pray that the fountain hasn't been used to clean a chicken that morning. There's no real soap, but you might have a little bit of natron, a salty cleaning powder that exfoliates both your skin and your self-esteem in equal measure. But if business was slow yesterday and you've got a few extra coins jangling in your purse, you might just splurge on a visit to the public baths, the great Roman equalizer where everyone went. You'd find merchants, soldiers, philosophers, and that one guy who always talks way too loudly about his hemorrhoids. You undress, stuff your belongings into a little wall niche that you trust way too easily, and wade into a vast pool of tepid water that's full of floating philosophical debates, and yes, someone else's toenail. Inside you can sweat it out in the steam room, scrape your skin clean with a strigil, a curved metal blade, and enjoy a brief, glorious moment of being the cleanest person on your street. A title that will last for approximately 5 minutes. After the bath, you dry off, apply even more perfume, and try to remember if anyone has invented deodorant yet. They haven't. To finish the look, it's back to the makeup. A bit of chalk-based powder for the face, a hint of rouge for the cheeks and lips, and a thick line of kohl around the eyes. The goal isn't necessarily to highlight your beauty, it's to hide the bone-deep fatigue. Clients don't want to see the woman who's already dealt with 3 senators and a drunken sailor before noon. They want mystery, allure, and someone who doesn't smell like old lentils. So, you're washed, or at least convincingly perfumed. Your makeup is on point, successfully hiding the fact that you've slept about 3 hours, and your soul is slowly leaking out of your ears. Now it's time to get dressed. And while Roman society had a lot of complicated opinions about fashion, there was one specific outfit that sent a very, very clear message. I'm talking about the female toga. Yes, the toga. That flowing white garment we usually associate with stuffy senators, all-powerful emperors, and really terrible college frat parties. But here's the twist. In ancient Rome, when a woman wore a toga, she wasn't making a political statement. She was making a professional one. It was a giant, wearable billboard that screamed, "I am not a respectable matron, and I am absolutely available for negotiation." See, proper, respectable Roman wives, the matronae, wore the stola. This was a long, layered, modest dress that basically said, "My husband controls my dowry, my virtue is impeccable, and I go to bed at 9 p.m. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were legally forbidden from wearing the stola. Instead, they were often required to wear a toga, which was usually short, made of cheaper material, and dyed in a bright, flashy colour. Think less Grecian goddess, and more visible from across the entire forum. The look was usually accessorised with cheap jewellery, bronze or glass beads, maybe some loud, clanking earrings. The goal wasn't elegance, it was visibility. When you're competing with 20 other women in a 100-metre radius, subtlety is a luxury you simply cannot afford. Your footwear would likely be a pair of simple sandals, or maybe even just your own bare feet, depending on your budget and location. Comfort wasn't really a priority when you knew you were going to spend most of the day standing, walking, and occasionally sprinting away from a bad client or an overzealous moralist. And of course, the hair. Hair was a whole other ordeal. Roman prostitutes often curled and dyed their hair, sometimes wearing elaborate wigs. Blonde wigs are especially popular, often imported from the northern provinces of Gaul. In Rome, blonde hair had a certain exotic, wild appeal, kind of like imported luxury soap, only more alive and probably less clean. Once you put it all together, the flashy toga, the cheap jewellery, the blonde wig and the heavy makeup, you looked obvious. And that was the entire point. In a city of 1 million people, your outfit was your business card. If it made you look bold, scandalous and economically available, then congratulations. You're ready for another glorious day of being judged by society while also being actively funded by it. So, you're dressed, you're painted, you're perfumed. Now comes the fun part. Drumming up business in a city where everyone wants what you're selling, but pretends they're shocked to find out it's for sale. In ancient Rome, marketing wasn't subtle. There were no pamphlets, no websites, and definitely no branding consultants. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, or be immortalized in graffiti. Preferably all three. Let's start with location, location, location. If you worked out of a lupanar or brothel, your office was already built for maximum visibility. Brothels were often conveniently located near bathhouses, markets, or taverns. In short, anywhere people might already be sweaty, bored, or easily persuaded. Think of it as ancient foot traffic optimization. You'd stand in the doorway, wearing your finest look-at-me outfit, and call out to passers-by with a mix of flattery, negotiation, and maybe a few time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick. It might sound desperate, but hey, rent was due, and the girl in the next doorway just dropped her rate to 1. If you were a freelancer, it was all about roaming visibility. You might hover near the temples because nothing says divine inspiration like a bit of temptation. Or you could hang around the taverns ready to flirt with a tipsy legionary who still had some coin left in his purse and some questionable judgment left in his head. But perhaps the most bizarre and weirdly effective form of Roman advertising was the wall graffiti. Yes, the ruins of Pompeii have immortalized the absolute genius of ancient street marketing. Brothel walls were plastered with handwritten reviews like an ancient unfiltered Yelp. You'd find gems like Myrtis, you suck, or Felix was here twice, and even helpful service notes like Felicia, 2 denarii, very fast service. Some women even paid someone to write their name and specialty on a visible wall near a tavern. Or they'd let their clients do the writing, which could range from glowing praise to a confused haiku about being overcharged. All of this made one thing clear. A prostitute's survival depended as much on her marketing skills as her other talents. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and your approximate level of enthusiasm, someone else was getting the business. Because in ancient Rome, just like today, the secret to success wasn't always talent. Sometimes it was just better PR. So, you've advertised. You've got a client's attention. Now it's time to talk pricing. The part where ancient Rome pretends to be a free market while secretly judging your life choices. Let's be clear, there was no union, no set rates. Prices were determined by supply, demand, and whatever you could get away with before someone tried to barter you down with a loaf of stale bread. For a street-level worker, prices could be shockingly low, as little as 1 or 2 asses, a small bronze coin that wouldn't even buy you a decent glass of wine. That's right. Some clients were paying less for you than they were for their lunch. If that feels depressing, just remember that some women were forced to accept food, a pair of sandals, or even just IOUs as payment. On the other end of the spectrum were the high-end prostitutes, the meretresses. These women were luxury brands. They could charge in silver denarii, sometimes multiple coins per client, especially if they offered skills beyond the bedroom. Things like witty conversation, the ability to play a musical instrument, or being able to recite poetry. Anything that let a wealthy client believe they weren't just hiring company, they were hiring taste. Of course, if you worked under a pimp, lino, or a brothel owner, a hefty cut of your earnings vanished before you ever saw a single coin. And some women were enslaved, which meant they didn't get paid at all. They received only food and shelter, and the vague, often empty promise that one day they might be able to buy their freedom if they somehow managed to win the Roman lottery. Alright, so you've got your uniform, you've got your brand immortalised in some questionable graffiti, and you've got a price list that ranges from luxury to a slightly used sandal. Now for the big question, where do you actually set up shop? In ancient Rome, you had a few distinct career paths, each with its own unique flavour of chaos. Let's start with the most famous, the official office. Welcome to the lupanar, the Roman brothel. Technically, it's a place of business. Realistically, it's a sweaty stone maze of bad decisions. The term lupana actually comes from the Latin word lupa, which means she-wolf, which was also Roman slang for a prostitute. That's right. Your job title was also your unflattering animal comparison. Not exactly empowering, but at least it's consistent. Most lupanars were two-story buildings, strategically crammed between bathhouses and bars, perfect for catching foot traffic from half-drunk senators and bored sailors. Inside, you've got a narrow hallway lined with tiny windowless rooms, each equipped with a stone bed, a thin mattress, and just enough space to deeply reconsider your life choices. There were no doors, just flimsy curtains for that trendy open-floor plan vibe. Privacy, that was something rich matrons had. You've got damp linen and the sound of someone snoring through your shared wall. Of course, you weren't alone in this venture. A proper lupanar had several working women and one delightful parasite known as the leno, the pimp, or the lena, the madam. Their job was to take a massive cut of your earnings, promise repairs to the leaky roof that would never ever happen, and occasionally yell helpful things like, "Work faster. That one's important." Your clientele was a mixed bag, ranging from nervous teenagers spending their allowance, to sweaty legionaries on leave, to balding senators claiming this was all just a philosophical visit. Some were in and out faster than a dropped denarius. Others tried to talk about their terrible poetry, which frankly was much worse. During downtime, you'd sit near the entrance trying to pull off your best "I'm flirty but dead inside" expression, while calling out to passers-by. Marketing was mostly volume-based. 2 coins! Special price today! I'll even pretend to listen to you talk about your day. And yes, the walls were covered in that famous graffiti. Ancient Yelp reviews etched lovingly into the plaster. Felix was here twice. Or, Thais gives a good time. Occasionally someone got artsy and drew pictures. Proportions were rarely accurate. Confidence, however, was never lacking. Working in a lupanar wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. You had a roof over your head, mostly a bed, if you squinted, and if nothing else, you always had a front row seat to humanity's weirdest, saddest parade. But maybe the chaotic office cubicle life wasn't for you. Maybe you preferred something a little more social. In that case, you might find yourself working at a tavern. If the brothel was a dedicated office, the tavern was more like working in an open-air startup, but with more vomit and fewer stock options. Taverns, or kalpanae, were where Rome's finest drunkards, off-duty soldiers, and guys named Gaius with gambling debts all gathered to drink, shout, and pretend they understood Virgil. For a prostitute working here, the job description was simple: serve the wine, sell the charm, and dodge the gropes. A typical shift involved pouring watered-down wine into dirty cups for people who wouldn't notice the difference anyway. With your other hand, you flirted just enough to keep the coins flowing, but not so much that a brawl broke out. Unless the brawl was entertaining, in which case, carry on. Unlike the brothel, taverns were technically food establishments, so you had the delightful aromatic backdrop of boiled cabbage, fermenting fish sauce, and unwashed body odour. It was a scent that clung to your tunic and your soul, but it also meant you could upsell a client. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't smell of garum. Some women worked the back rooms or upstairs areas, effectively making the tavern a part-time brothel with table service. Others kept things more casual, offering company, lap-sitting, and heavily suggestive compliments like, "My, your toga looks clean." This was high praise in Rome. Payment was always immediate. Credit did not exist. If a client tried to delay, you had options. You could yell, threaten, or grab the bouncer, who was usually a retired gladiator with one eye, a short temper, and a deep-seated hatred for poets. The upside? Taverns offered more foot traffic and sometimes better tips. The downside? You were a waitress, a therapist, and a hostage negotiator all at once, and nobody in ancient Rome tipped for emotional labour. It was an unpredictable, exhausting, and smelly job, but it paid the bills, sometimes. If the customers didn't vomit on your sandals first. Finally, for the true entrepreneur with no brothel affiliation and an unhealthy amount of confidence, there was always the street. Freelance prostitution in Rome meant walking the fine line between independent contractor and please don't arrest me. The Roman streets were alive with opportunity and sewage. Prostitutes who worked outdoors were called prostibulae, and they roamed the alleys, bathhouse entrances, and marketplaces. Some even worked the temple steps, because nothing says divine intervention like offering a discount outside a shrine to Venus. Daylight hours were good for business, but risky. You had to navigate gawking citizens, nosy magistrates, and angry matrons who were convinced your existence was personally ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler, it wasn't. Your job was to be visible. You had to stand out, so you dressed brightly, with short tunics and flashy jewellery. The goal was to catch a client's eye before his wife caught him looking. Approaching a customer involved a delicate dance of flirtation, timing, and not getting mistaken for someone's runaway slave. Competition was fierce. You weren't just up against your fellow freelancers, you were up against drunken party girls and even retired gladiators with a side hustle. There were no benefits and no security, just your charm, your wits, and your ability to walk very, very fast in sandals. For all its chaos, however, the street had its advantages. You set your own hours, you kept all of your profits, and you didn't have to answer to a pimp breathing down your neck. Sure, the job came with the occasional drunk goat herder or a philosophical heckler, but at least you were your own boss. And in a city where bosses were rarely the good guys, that was something. But no matter where you worked, the brothel, the tavern, or the street, there was one client you could never ever avoid: the Roman tax collector. So you've navigated the brothel, the bar, and the street. You've dodged bad clients, questionable smells, and at least one retired gladiator with a temper problem. You might think you're your own boss, an independent contractor in the bustling gig economy of ancient Rome, but you'd be wrong. Because no matter where you worked, there was one client you could never ever avoid: the Roman tax collector. Yes, the Roman Empire. Brilliant engineers, conquerors of the known world and champions of the toga, also invented a dedicated tax just for prostitutes. It was called the vectigal ex capturis, and it was a state-sanctioned system that ensured even your most awkward encounters contributed to Rome's public infrastructure. Congratulations, your nightly services just helped fund another aqueduct. And this wasn't some unofficial pocket-skimming operation. This was managed by professional collectors known as publicani, men who were somehow both incredibly boring and absolutely terrifying. They kept detailed records on wax tablets, demanded payment in cash, and probably judged your perfume choices while they were at it. To operate legally, you first had to register your profession with the aediles, who were the Roman equivalent of a city inspector with a major in paperwork and a PhD in moral superiority. Upon registration, you were officially entered into a list of sex workers. Think of it as joining a trade union, except there were zero benefits, and instead of a membership card, you got a permanent stain on your reputation, and in some cases, you got a literal brand. Some enslaved sex workers were branded or tattooed with marks like Lupa, she-wolf, or their owner's name. This wasn't for the client's benefit. It was to make sure you could never quit and pretend to be a respectable citizen later. The tax rate itself varied, but it always stung. You might pay per act or per week, and there were absolutely no deductions for emotional labour, uncomfortable silences, or the existential dread that came with the job. Refusing to pay could get you fined, arrested, or barred from working altogether. Rome was essentially saying, "We completely disapprove of your lifestyle. Also, give us 10%. But hey, on the bright side, at least you could proudly say your labour was helping to fund another beautiful marble temple, probably one dedicated to a goddess who still wouldn't return your prayers. Now, paying taxes to an empire that judged you was one thing. Dealing with the unpaid, unofficial moral police was a whole other level of fun. In Rome, being a prostitute meant you had legal permission to exist and social permission to be endlessly judged by absolutely everyone. At the top of this hypocrisy food chain was the Roman Senate. This was a delightful group of aging elites who loved to give long, boring speeches about preserving Roman virtue, a concept they typically defined as whatever we're not currently being caught doing. Many of them would publicly rail against the city's moral decay in the afternoon, while discreetly maintaining a tab at every brothel from the Forum to the Subura by nightfall. Then you had the writers, guys like Juvenal and Seneca, who had an absolute field day. They would mock prostitutes in their satires and poems, lumping them in with greedy merchants and, the horror of horrors, women who read books. And yet, these same writers would provide vivid, suspiciously detailed descriptions of brothel life, almost as if they'd done extensive hands-on research for their work. And let's not forget the respectable wives of the elite, the matronae. They wouldn't speak to you, of course. That would be beneath them. But they would walk past your street corner with a judgmental gaze so intense it could sterilize a fig tree. Some of them even petitioned for new laws to ban prostitutes from wearing jewellery or entering the public baths, which is incredibly rich, considering many of their husbands treated the bathhouse like a part-time job. This was your daily reality, being shamed by the very people whose husbands and sons kept you in business. Between the taxes and the trolls, this job also came with some serious occupational hazards. Welcome to the health and wellness chapter of our story, where the only prescription is hope you survive. Let's start with the big one, venereal disease. The Romans didn't have germ theory, but they definitely knew that some encounters left you with more than a few coins and a bad poem. Roman texts describe symptoms ranging from persistent itching to, and I quote, things falling off that shouldn't. The official medical advice for this was usually a helpful mix of vinegar washes, herbal ointments, and desperate prayers to Venus. Pregnancy was another constant concern. There was no birth control pill, but there were options, if you had the guts and the budget. Prostitutes used natural contraceptives like silphium, an herb that was so famously over-harvested for this exact reason that it went extinct. They also used animal intestines as crude condoms and wool tampons soaked in various herbal concoctions. The effectiveness of these methods was somewhere between maybe and a literal miracle. If pregnancy did occur, things got complicated. Some women raised their children within the brothel, while others were forced to give them up to foundling homes or tragically abandon them on the streets. Infanticide wasn't legal, but turning a blind eye? That was practically a civic duty in Rome. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Depression, trauma, anxiety, all just another part of the job. Ancient Rome didn't have therapists. You had your fellow prostitutes, you had wine, and you had the occasional stray cat who would listen to your problems without judgment. For day-to-day ailments like sore muscles or stress-induced rage blackouts, the go-to remedy was usually more wine, maybe some opium if you could get it, or a slap from your Leno to stop whining. In a city where divine intervention was blamed for everything from floods to flatulence, you needed all the help you could get from this world and the next. So you're being taxed by the state, judged by the public, and your body is staging a quiet rebellion against you. In a city where divine intervention was blamed for everything from floods to flatulence, who do you turn to? You turn to the gods. Religion in Rome was a full-time job, and for a prostitute, the gods were your HR department. Mostly useless, occasionally helpful, and always accepting offerings. Your primary go-to deity was, of course, Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and general poor decision-making. Many women would have a small altar to her in their tiny rooms. Offerings of flowers, cheap perfume, or a single hard-earned coin were made in the desperate hope of attracting better clients, more charm, or at the very least customers who didn't smell like boiled goat. Next on the list was Fortuna, the goddess of luck. Given that your daily income could range from a gold bracelet to 3 mouldy grapes and a vague promise, Fortuna was kind of a big deal. You'd wear a charm with her likeness, or mumble a quick prayer before a guy with suspiciously clean sandals and too many rings walked in. But religion wasn't all glitter and hope. The darker side of belief was superstition and magical countermeasures, because when in doubt, blame the spirits. You'd burn incense to ward off the evil eye or hire a professional witch to curse a rival prostitute's hairline. And this wasn't just a theory. Archaeologists have found cursed tablets called defictions all over Roman brothel districts. They read like ancient Yelp revenge reviews. May her tongue rot. May her clients dry up. May she trip in the street and land in donkey dung. Love in this world was complicated. At best, it was a pleasant delusion. At worst, a financial liability and a toga. Clients fell in love all the time, or at least they claimed to, usually after 3 cups of wine and a long monologue about their mother. "Baby, I'm different," they'd say, clutching your hand like a tragic poet. And you'd nod politely while mentally calculating how much he still owed you for the evening. Emotional labour was part of the package. Smile, listen, and pretend his toga doesn't smell of despair. But romance was a dangerous distraction. Roman law was very clear. Prostitutes were legally categorized as infames or infamous, which meant you could not legally marry a citizen even if you wanted to. That didn't stop some from hoping. There are countless tales of women who were promised freedom, marriage, and a little house with a garden, only to be abandoned the moment another woman with better eyeliner walked by. That said, real bonds were far more likely to form between fellow prostitutes. You worked together, endured the same insults, and probably shared the same lice. These friendships often became sisterhoods, a vital support system in a hostile world. So, what happened when the blush wore off, the client stopped lingering, and your joints started popping louder than your earrings? What was the retirement plan for a Roman prostitute? Well, you didn't disappear, you just changed careers. The luckiest ones, who had saved carefully or found a rare, generous patron, might buy their freedom and start a new business. Many would open their own taverns or bathhouses, becoming the boss and renting out rooms to the next generation of desperate optimists. Others became madams, or lene, the brothel version of upper management. Less action, more shouting. As a leaner, you didn't need to be young or pretty. You needed to be sharp, intimidating, and fluent in threats involving sandals and overdue debts. You ran the schedules, kept the books, and made sure the curtains were only mildly horrifying. A few other retired sex workers leaned into fortune-telling. After all, when you've heard every confession and watched every mistake a man can make walk through your door, predicting doom becomes second nature. But for many, there were no lucky breaks. They simply kept working, adjusting their marketing from blushing flower to experience discreet and tolerates poetry. And for those with no savings and no patrons, the options were grim. You begged. You cleaned temples, you worked until your hands turned into shriveled olives. Rome didn't care how you got old, only that you did so quietly. For many of these women, survival itself was the achievement. If you made it to old age with your wit intact and at least one working sandal, you were already a legend. Which brings us to the end of our tour. When people think of ancient Rome, they picture marble statues and grand speeches. What they rarely picture is the woman leaning in a brothel doorway, adjusting her wig and mentally calculating how many coins she needs to not starve next week. These women have been carefully edited out of the noble narrative, but they were everywhere. In graffiti, in legal records, in satires, and in receipts. They were a fixture of daily Roman life, even as society treated them like morally contagious wallpaper. History often gets it wrong, painting them as either powerless victims or evil seductresses. The reality is that many were savvy, adaptable, and better at business than half the Senate. They were enslaved, they were free, they catered to the rich and the poor, they worked, they laughed, they scammed, they wept, and they endured. All without marble statues or gilded tombs. Their only memorials are the faint ink on a crumbling wall in Pompeii. Myrtis was here, it might say, and worth every coin. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the glory of Rome, remember that behind every toga-clad philosopher was a working girl keeping the economy and the gossip alive. And now, we leave the crowded, complicated streets of Rome behind. We travel north to a land of ice and fire, of longships and legends, a world where survival depended not on wit and commerce, but on raw strength, fierce loyalty, and a deep, intimate knowledge of the harsh, unforgiving earth. We are going to the world of the Vikings. All right. We've left the crowded, complicated streets of Rome behind. We're travelling north to a land of ice and fire, of longships and legends, A world where survival depended not on wit and commerce, but on raw strength, fierce loyalty, and a deep, intimate knowledge of a harsh, unforgiving earth. We're going to the world of the Vikings. In this world, warfare wasn't an occasional event. It was a constant presence. And with it came a whole menu of grisly injuries, deep cuts from swords, gaping axe wounds, broken bones, and burns from both fire and frost. When you got hurt, you didn't go to a hospital. You went to the Leichnir, the healer. These were highly respected members of society who combined the practical knowledge of herbs with the spiritual traditions of Norse belief. Forget sterile gauze and antiseptic spray. The Viking first aid kit was basically a handful of weeds and a whole lot of yelling. Let's start with the most important tool for any self-respecting battlefield medic, yarrow. Known for its incredible ability to staunch bleeding, yarrow was the Viking warrior's best friend. Viking healers would crush the leaves and apply them directly into a wound, either by themselves or mixed into a poultice. Yarrow acted as a coagulant, helping to stop the blood flow and prevent infection. It was also believed to have sacred properties, with legends connecting its power to the All-Father himself, Odin. The process was both methodical and ritualistic. The healer might wash the wound with boiled water infused with other antiseptic herbs, slap on the crushed yarrow, and then bind the whole mess tightly with linen or animal skin strips. In some cases, they'd recite chants or prayers while working, invoking a little divine protection to go along with the herbal remedy. Healing wasn't just physical after all, it was also spiritual. And yarrow wasn't just for battle wounds. A tea made from its flowers could be used to reduce fevers or ease digestive complaints. Now, stopping the bleeding is great, but the real killer on the battlefield is what comes next. Infection. To fight that, the Viking healer brought out the heavy artillery, angelica. This tall aromatic plant was so valuable that it was still being cultivated in monastery gardens long after the Viking Age ended. Angelica was the Viking version of a broad-spectrum antibiotic. Healers used the root, leaves, and seeds for all sorts of treatments. Most commonly, the root was dried and steeped into a tea to fight internal infections. It had a warming effect on the body and was used to stimulate circulation and reduce inflammation. For a festering wound, a healer might grind the root into a salve with animal fat or beeswax and slather it on. But Angelica's power wasn't just physical. In Norse cosmology, some plants were believed to carry divine energy. While its name is Latin, the reverence for this plant was pure Norse. It was believed to be a gift from the gods, a symbol of protection and sacred power. Women, who were often the primary herbalists in the household, used it to regulate menstrual cycles and ease the dangers of childbirth. And because of its reputation as a purifier, Angelica was also used in smoke rituals to cleanse homes and ward off disease. In every Viking community, from a remote farm to a bustling coastal town, Angelica was a cornerstone of natural medicine, a trusted ally in the quest to preserve life in a harsh and unpredictable world. Of course, surviving a Viking raid was one thing. Surviving a Viking winter was another. After months of darkness, cold, and a diet of dried fish, people were often weakened and fatigued. But as spring arrived, it brought with it the ancient Norse equivalent of a supercharged energy drink, birch sap. The birch tree, found all over Scandinavia, was more than just a source of wood. It was a living pharmacy. Vikings would tap the trees in early spring to collect the clear, slightly sweet sap as it rose from the roots. This was a seasonal practice that required perfect timing. Healers used this sap as a tonic for anyone weakened by the long winter. It was served fresh or sometimes fermented into a lightly alcoholic drink, known for its revitalizing qualities. Rich in minerals, electrolytes and natural sugars, birch sap helped rehydrate the body and restore lost energy. In an age without modern nutrition science, the Vikings knew the restorative power of this gift from nature. The birch tree was useful in other ways too. The bark, when boiled, produced a tar-like substance with antiseptic properties, perfect for treating skin infections. And the leaves were used in poultices and steam baths to draw out toxins from the body. Symbolically, the birch tree represented renewal and purity. It was often the first tree to grow back after land was cleared, a perfect symbol of resilience. The use of its sap in healing reflected this belief, offering the promise of recovery after hardship. For the healer, birch sap was a seasonal treasure, a clear, life-giving elixir that marked the end of the darkness and the persistence of health in a cold and often merciless land. Alright, so our Viking healer has patched up the warrior with yarrow, fought off infection with Angelica, and handed him a revitalizing cup of birch sap. But the work of a Leichnir is never done. The world is full of other problems, from lingering fevers to restless spirits. To deal with those, you needed to bring out the next level of your botanical arsenal. Let's start with a plant revered for its powerful cleansing properties, both physical and spiritual, juniper. Growing all over the rocky soils of Scandinavia, juniper was the Viking version of a Swiss Army knife. You could burn it, boil it, or brew it to purify the body, the air, and even the soul. The berries were commonly used as a diuretic, helping the body flush out harmful substances. This was especially useful for illnesses that involved swelling or bloating. But its real power was in its smoke. Healers would burn dried juniper branches and let the smoke fill a room or a tent, believing it could literally drive out disease. And they weren't entirely wrong. The antimicrobial compounds in juniper smoke helped disinfect the air. So, after a particularly nasty bout of sickness, or after someone died, the Viking home would get a thorough juniper smudging. It was both a practical public health measure and a spiritual reset button, banishing what could be seen and what could not. Juniper branches were also used in steam baths and sweat lodges, laid on the hot stones to release an invigorating vapour that opened the lungs and was thought to cleanse the soul. For Viking healers, juniper was a guardian plant, a symbol of renewal and defence, keeping sickness at bay one breath of sacred smoke at a time. Now, after all that spiritual cleansing, what about good old-fashioned pain? For that, the Vikings turned to something a little gentler, meadowsweet. Found in damp meadows, this fragrant plant with creamy white flowers was a staple in Norse herbal medicine. It was used to treat headaches, joint pain, and fevers. Healers would dry the flowers and leaves and steep them into a tea for anyone suffering from general aches and pains, which, in a culture built on raiding and farming in a harsh climate, was pretty much everyone, all the time. But here's the mind-blowing part. Unbeknownst to the Vikings, meadowsweet contains compounds very similar to salicylic acid. If that sounds familiar, it's because salicylic acid is the key ingredient in modern aspirin. The Vikings didn't have advanced chemistry labs, but they had generations of observation and results. They didn't know why it worked, they just knew that this sweet-smelling tea reduced fevers, eased swelling, and provided relief from discomfort. They had, in effect, discovered nature's Tylenol. In a culture that respected raw strength, meadowsweet was a quiet but powerful ally, helping warriors rest and children recover. But what if your problem wasn't a headache, but something darker? What if you were a warrior plagued by nightmares after a raid? What if your very spirit felt out of balance? For that, you needed to move from medicine to magic. For that, you needed mugwort. Known for its bitter aroma and silvery leaves, mugwort was considered one of the most sacred plants in Germanic and Norse tradition. It was the bridge between the body, the mind, and the unseen world. Medically, it was used to treat digestive problems and calm the nervous system. For warriors who experienced restlessness or nightmares, mugwort tea or smoke was thought to restore inner balance and protect the mind. Some would even place it under their pillow to coax back a peaceful sleep. This wasn't just superstition. Many aromatic herbs do have mild sedative effects. But mugwort's real power was in ritual and magic. Viking healers and wise women, sometimes called a velva, used mugwort in ceremonies to invoke dreams, visions, or protection. It was often burned during rites of Seder, the powerful Norse form of trance magic and prophecy. The rising smoke was believed to carry prayers to the gods and ward off evil spirits. A bundle of mugwort might be hung over a doorway for protection, or carried in a pouch during a long sea journey. To the Viking healer, mugwort was more than just a plant. It was an ancient ally that stood at the intersection of medicine and magic, guiding the sick not just toward physical recovery, but toward spiritual realignment with the world and the gods. Alright, so our Viking healer has purified your soul with juniper, cured your headache with protoaspirin, and protected your dreams from nightmares with a bit of magic mugwort. But what about the really nasty stuff? What about deep infections and parasites? For that, they brought out a pungent little powerhouse that was likely acquired through trade: garlic. Though not native to Scandinavia, its reputation clearly preceded it. The Vikings knew a good thing when they smelled it, and garlic's potent medicinal qualities made it an essential part of their medical kit. Its antibacterial and antifungal properties were legendary, even if they couldn't tell you the science behind it. Healers would use crushed garlic in poultices to clean wounds and prevent them from festering, which was incredibly important for injuries sustained during a raid or a particularly clumsy Tuesday. Yes, it probably stung like crazy, but it was effective in preventing minor wounds from turning deadly. Internally, garlic was a cure-all. It was often eaten raw or brewed into strong infusions to strengthen the immune system and purify the blood. During the harsh northern winters, when coughs and fevers were as common as bad moods, garlic was a valuable tonic. It was also used to treat intestinal worms, which were a common problem due to poor sanitation. A lovely mixture of garlic and vinegar would be administered to purge the body. And of course, beyond the physical, garlic was believed to repel evil spirits and malevolent forces. So, it wasn't just fighting bacteria, it was fighting literal demons. 2 for the price of 1. Next up, a plant that truly embodies the Viking spirit, the stinging nettle. This wasn't just a pesky weed, it was a plant of power. Despite its painful sting, nettle was one of the most useful and respected herbs in Norse healing. It was a natural tonic, packed with iron and vitamin C, making it perfect for combating fatigue and weakness, especially after a long winter of eating nothing but dried fish. A nice cup of nettle tea was believed to purify the blood and rebuild strength. But its most metal application was a practice called urtication. This involved literally striking sore or arthritic limbs with fresh nettle stalks. Though incredibly painful, it was believed to stimulate circulation and bring warmth and life back to cold, stiff parts of the body. Think of it as Viking acupuncture, but with more screaming and immediate regret. For the healer, the nettle was a perfect symbol. a reminder that even the most painful things can bring healing, and that power often comes from what first seems harmful. And that, in a nutshell, was the Viking healer's world. This knowledge wasn't written down in fancy textbooks. It lived in the spoken word, in chants passed from mother to daughter, and in the quiet work of wise women who blended tradition, observation, and a deep connection to the earth. To treat an illness wasn't just to cure a body. It was to restore balance to the person, the household, and the invisible threads connecting them to the gods. With the spread of Christianity, much of this oral tradition faded or was absorbed into new frameworks. But the legacy of these healers lies not just in the herbs they used, but in the worldview they preserved. That nature holds power, that healing is both physical and spiritual, and that wisdom often resides in the hands of those who listen to the land. Music. The Viking drums and horns play a final, powerful and conclusive note. After a moment of silence, a new theme begins. It's somber, epic, and slightly tragic, with hints of French folk melodies and a lone female voice humming. Host. Voice shifts, becoming more narrative and serious. And now we leave the misty fjords and the world of Norse gods behind. We travel south and forward in time to the 15th century. We are going to a France fractured by war and civil unrest. The 100 Years' War between England and France has dragged on for decades, and the nation is on its knees. It is a time of instability, fear, and a desperate longing for a miracle. And in a quiet rural village called Domremy, that miracle is about to be born. She was born in the winter of 1412 to a devout peasant family. She was not taught to read or write, like most girls of her class. Her world was humble, consisting of helping around the house, tending sheep, and spending hours in deep, devoted prayer. Her name was Joan, and at the age of 13, her life and the course of a kingdom would change forever. So we have our setting, a war-torn kingdom on the brink of collapse, and we have our protagonist, a devout, illiterate peasant girl from a forgotten village. From these humble origins, no one could have imagined that she would one day stand before kings, lead armies, and challenge the might of empires. But that all started at the age of 13, when her life changed forever. She later testified that in the summer of 1425, while she was alone in her father's garden, she experienced something extraordinary. It began with a dazzling, brilliant light, and then a voice that seemed to come from beyond this world. As you can imagine, she was terrified. The voice was soon accompanied by the appearance of figures she came to identify as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, three of the most powerful saints in the Catholic tradition. Now these visions would continue over the next few years, growing in intensity and clarity. And the message they delivered was staggering. It was essentially a divine to-do list for a teenage girl with no military experience, no education, and zero social standing. Her mission, as dictated by the heavens, was twofold. First, she was to drive the English out of French territory, and second, she was to ensure the coronation of Charles, the Dauphin, as the rightful king of France at the City of Reims. It was an absolutely insane revelation. For a while, Joan told no one. She kept the visions and the voices a secret, fearing that she'd be disbelieved, punished, or declared a witch. But the voices persisted, urging her to act. She became even more devout, fasting, praying, and preparing herself for the mission she was now convinced was real and ordained by God himself. By 1428, the military situation in France had become critical. The English had captured huge swathes of the north, and the strategic city of Orléans was under siege. If Orléans fell, the entire French cause would likely collapse. The Dauphin, Charles, remained uncrowned, his legitimacy hanging by a thread. Joan, now 16, believed the time had finally come to act. She travelled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and somehow managed to get an audience with the local commander, a man named Robert de Baudricourt. She claimed she had a divine message for the Dauphin. As you might expect, Baudricourt and his men basically laughed her out of the room. A teenage peasant girl claiming to have a direct line to God was hardly taken seriously, but Joan was persistent. She returned again and again, speaking with a conviction that started to unnerve some and impress others. Her big break came when she apparently made a stunningly accurate prediction. She foretold a specific French military setback near Orléans, describing the defeat to Baudricourt's men before any official news had reached the town. When messengers later arrived and confirmed her prediction was true, it was a game changer. This wasn't just some delusional girl. This was something else. Convinced, or at least intrigued enough to pass the buck, Baudricourt finally relented. He agreed to provide her with an armed escort to travel to the Dauphin's court at Chinon. For her safety on the long and dangerous journey through enemy-held territory, she would dress in men's clothing. And just like that, Joan of Arc's journey from peasant child to military envoy had begun, fueled by an unshakable faith and a truly wild sense of destiny. So, our 16-year-old peasant girl, dressed in men's clothing and fueled by divine visions, has convinced a battle-hardened commander to give her an armed escort. She now embarks on a journey that is, by all accounts, insane. In early 1429, she had to travel more than 300 miles to reach Chinon, the location of the Dauphin's court. This wasn't a pleasant road trip. This was a grueling 11-day trek straight through enemy territory, a landscape controlled by the hostile English and their Burgundian allies. For a young woman, even one disguised as a man, this journey was fraught with peril. Yet, she arrived unharmed. When she finally stood before the royal court at Chinon, she was met not with open arms, but with a wall of skepticism and courtly intrigue. Imagine the scene: a royal court in exile, full of broke, desperate nobles, all whispering and plotting, and into this nest of vipers walks a teenager in borrowed soldier's clothes, smelling of the road and claiming to have a direct message from the Almighty. It's a tough sell. Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, was a man drowning in doubt. He was wary of plots, of trickery, and probably of his own shadow. He wasn't about to risk his entire kingdom on the word of some strange girl from the countryside. So, he decided to test her. In a classic move of royal paranoia, Charles disguised himself in plain clothes and hid among his dozens of courtiers when Joan was brought into the great hall. This was the moment, the test. Joan, who had never seen the Dauphin before, walked into the crowded hall. The lavishly dressed nobles stared. The man, pretending to be the Dauphin, sat on the throne, waiting for her to make a fool of herself. But Joan didn't even glance at him. Guided, as she claimed, by her voices, she walked straight through the crowd of onlookers, directly to the real Charles, and knelt before him. Witnesses were absolutely astonished. But she didn't stop there. She reportedly leaned in and told him things that only he could possibly know, perhaps revealing the details of a secret private prayer he had made to God, a prayer in which he expressed his deepest doubts about his own legitimacy as king. For many in the court, this was the first undeniable sign that something beyond mortal explanation was at work. Still, Charles was cautious. Being king meant you couldn't just hire people who claimed to talk to saints. You had to have it verified by the HR department, which in this case was the church. He ordered that Joan be sent to the city of Poitiers for a full theological examination. For several weeks she was relentlessly questioned by a panel of high-ranking learned men, bishops, doctors of theology, and lawyers. Picture the scene. A 17-year-old uneducated girl being cross-examined by some of the most educated and cynical men in France. They grilled her on her visions, her faith, her theology, and of course her habit of wearing men's clothing, which was considered a serious religious offence. Yet she answered every question with a simple, unshakable faith and a sharp intelligence that baffled them. Her virginity was also officially tested, as it was widely believed that a messenger of God must be pure. The examiners could find nothing heretical in her claims. In their official report, they noted her remarkable character and stated that, given the desperate situation of the kingdom, the king would be wise to not dismiss her aid. They had found no evil in her, only goodness, humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, and simplicity. With the church's cautious seal of approval, Joan's mission could finally begin. But first, she needed the right equipment to signal her role, not as a common soldier, but as a divine emissary. She asked for a banner. The one she received was white, embroidered with an image of Jesus holding the world, flanked by 2 angels and the words, Jesus Maria. She would treasure this banner, carrying it into every battle and famously stating that she loved it 40 times more than her sword. She was also fitted with a custom suit of white armour, a stunning sight that would make her an instantly recognisable figure on the battlefield. And for a sword, she claimed her voices had led her to a very specific one, a blade that was buried behind the altar of a chapel at Sainte-Catherine-de-Fierbois. When men were sent to look, they found the ancient rusted sword right where she said it would be. Now, armed with a holy sword, clad in shining armour, and riding under her sacred banner, Joan was ready. She was no longer just a peasant girl from Domremy. She was the Maid of Orléans, a living symbol of hope for a broken nation. She was just 17 years old, young, untrained, and utterly convinced that God himself had sent her to save France. Her arrival at the besieged city of Orléans would mark the beginning of one of the most legendary and unlikely military campaigns in all of history. So, our 17-year-old heroine is now, against all odds, a commander in the French army. But she wasn't being sent on some easy milk run. Her first task was to march into the heart of a military disaster, the city of Orléans. By the spring of 1429, Orléans had been under siege by the English for several months. It was the strategic key to the heart of France. If it fell, the French cause would likely collapse entirely. Inside the city walls, supplies were dwindling, morale was at rock bottom, and the people were on the verge of surrender. They were praying for a miracle. And then, a miracle arrived. On April 29th, Joan of Arc entered the city. Her arrival was an electrifying event. Clad in her custom-made white armour and riding a white horse, she was met by cheering crowds who saw her as a living answer to their prayers. She wasn't just another commander. She was a symbol of hope and divine favour, and her presence instantly reinvigorated the exhausted French troops and the terrified citizens. The professional French commanders, however, were still sceptical. They were seasoned veterans who believed in cautious defensive warfare. And now, this teenage girl with no formal military training was bursting onto the scene, talking with incredible boldness and authority, and urging them to take immediate aggressive action against the English fortifications. She wasn't suggesting it, she was insisting on it, claiming that her divine voices had already promised her victory. At first, they hesitated, but Joan's conviction was infectious. She didn't just talk about faith, she radiated it. Over the course of the next week, the French, spurred on by Joan's relentless energy, launched a series of daring offensives to break the siege, and Joan was not a commander who led from the rear. She rode into battle right alongside her soldiers, often placing herself in the most dangerous positions on the front lines. But she didn't just wield her sword. Her true weapon was her banner. She would ride into the thick of the fighting, holding her white banner high, her voice rallying the troops with cries of faith and purpose. Her courage was astonishing, and it inspired her soldiers to fight with a ferocity they hadn't felt in years. The climax of the battle came during the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, a key English stronghold. The fighting was fierce and bloody. During the assault, Joan was struck by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. The wound was serious. For any other soldier, it would have been the end of their day, if not their life. But Joan refused to retreat. She was carried off the field, had the wound quickly dressed. Some say she even pulled the arrow out herself. And then, incredibly, she returned to the battle. Her reappearance on the field, wounded but not broken, was the final decisive blow to English morale and the ultimate inspiration for the French. They saw her not as a mere mortal but as something more. They charged forward with renewed determination. On May 8th, just 9 days after her arrival, the unthinkable happened. The English, battered, demoralized, and perhaps a little spooked, lifted the siege and withdrew. It was a stunning, decisive, and utterly game-changing victory. For the first time in a generation, the French had dealt a major blow to the seemingly invincible English army. Joan's role in this was undeniable. Her leadership, her impossible courage, and her spiritual authority had single-handedly turned the tide. The victory at Orléans was more than just a military achievement. It was a turning point in the national consciousness of France. The peasant girl from Domremy had done the impossible. She was now, and forever would be, the Maid of Orléans. She'd fulfilled the first and most difficult part of her divine mission. And now, with the momentum of this incredible victory behind her, she turned her focus toward her second goal, to march deep into enemy territory and see the Dauphin finally crowned as the true King of France. The road to legitimacy had begun, so the Siege of Orléans is lifted. A victory so stunning, so improbable, that it felt like a direct message from God. For the first time in a generation, the French army felt invincible, and at its head was a teenage girl in white armor. With the first part of her divine mission accomplished, Joan's focus immediately shifted to the second and far more symbolic objective, the coronation of Charles the Dauphin. In her visions, this wasn't just a political move, it was a divine command. For Charles to be seen as the true legitimate king, he needed to be crowned and anointed with sacred oil at the cathedral in Reims. There was just one tiny problem. Reims was deep inside enemy territory, controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. To march an army there was considered military suicide, but Joan was adamant. Her belief that God had already cleared the path was absolute, and her incredible victory at Orléans had earned her a massive amount of political and military capital. After a few more swift victories along the Loire Valley, where the French army seemed to just sweep aside any English resistance, even the cautious Charles was convinced. In July of 1429, the French army set out on what would become known as the coronation journey. What followed was less of a military campaign and more of a triumphal procession. As Joan and the royal army marched through hostile lands, cities and castles that were expected to fight to the death simply opened their gates without resistance. Word of the Maid of Orleans had spread like wildfire. Her success was so miraculous that many believed to resist her was to resist the will of God himself. Her presence, riding at the head of the army under her white banner, created an aura of invincibility. On July 16th, the French forces reached Reims, and the city surrendered peacefully. The very next day, inside the magnificent Reims Cathedral, Charles the Dauphin was finally crowned King Charles VII of France. It was a moment of supreme triumph. Joan stood beside him during the ceremony, holding her banner high. It was the absolute fulfillment of the prophecy she had received from her voices. The illiterate peasant girl from a forgotten village had risen to command armies, conquer cities, and place a crown on her king's head. The people saw her not just as a heroine, but as a living saint, a messenger from God. But success, especially in a royal court, breeds jealousy and tension. With Charles now officially the king, the politicians and cautious nobles returned to the forefront. They had what they wanted, a legitimate monarch. Many of them now questioned Joan's continued influence. Her divine mission was in their eyes complete, but for Joan it was not. She pushed for a bold new objective, the liberation of Paris. The capital was still under English and Burgundian control, and for Joan, reclaiming it was the logical next step in freeing France. But King Charles and his advisors hesitated. They now favoured a negotiated truce, a path of diplomacy. Joan was resolute. She believed that any delay would only strengthen the enemy, and that God still willed them to fight for a total victory. Eventually, the king agreed to an assault on Paris, but without his full commitment. He provided limited troops and delayed the campaign, weakening the effort before it even truly began. In early September 1429, Joan arrived outside the heavily defended city. On September 8th, she led an assault on one of the main gates. As always, she was at the very front, banner in hand, urging the troops forward with prayers and her own fearless determination. But this time, there was no miracle. The fighting was fierce, the defenders were well prepared, and the attack stalled. During the battle, Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh. It was her second serious wound, but again, she refused to abandon the field. She continued to direct the battle, calling for another charge, but the momentum was lost. With casualties rising and nightfall approaching, the king's commanders ordered a retreat, directly against Joan's furious protests. The failed attack on Paris marked a crucial turning point. While Joan's reputation as a hero remained intact among the common soldiers and the citizens of France, at court, the doubts grew. Her aura of invincibility was broken. Her influence over the king and his policies began to wane. Charles, now a crowned king, no longer needed a prophet, he needed politicians. Despite her injuries, her dwindling support at court, and her growing political isolation, Joan remained convinced that her mission was not yet complete. She would not stop until all of France was free. But in the shadows of the royal court, betrayal and danger were closing in. After the high point of the coronation, and the bitter disappointment at Paris, Joan found herself in a strange new reality. She was a national hero, beloved by the common people and the soldiers who fought beside her. But in the snake pit of the royal court, she was becoming an inconvenience. Her divine mission for total victory clashed with King Charles's newfound desire for cautious diplomacy. He had his crown, and now he and his advisors wanted to play the long, slow game of politics. But Joan only knew one way to fight: forward. In the spring of 1430, acting largely on her own initiative, and with only lukewarm support from the king, she turned her attention to the town of Compiègne. The city was loyal to King Charles, but was under threat from hostile Burgundian forces. The French faction allied with the English. Joan arrived in May to help defend the city, a warrior saint answering the call to battle one last time. The odds were stacked against her. The Burgundian army was closing in with superior numbers. On May 23rd, 1430, Joan led a small force in a sortie, a daring raid outside the city walls to challenge the besiegers and disrupt their lines. As the battle unfolded, the small French force was pushed back towards the city gates. Joan, as always, remained at the very rear of the retreat, fighting fiercely to protect her soldiers as they scrambled back to safety. And then, betrayal. Whether through panic, incompetence, or deliberate treachery, the city gates were closed too soon. Joan and a few of her companions were trapped outside, cut off from the safety of the city walls. They were immediately surrounded by Burgundian cavalry. She fought until the very end, but she was pulled from her horse and taken captive. The capture of the Maid of Orleans was a devastating blow to French morale. The girl who had seemed invincible, who had lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned a king, was now a prisoner. The Burgundians knew exactly what they had. They held Joan for months, treating her not as a common captive, but as a priceless political prize. During her captivity, Joan's will remained unbroken. She attempted to escape more than once. In one famous instance, she jumped from a 70-foot high tower, injuring herself badly but surviving the fall. Even in chains, she was defiant. But King Charles, the man she'd placed on the throne, made no attempt to rescue her or pay her ransom. He had moved on. Joan was eventually sold to the English for a massive sum of 10,000 livres. The transaction was cold and political. The English didn't just want her as a prisoner, they wanted to destroy her. Her very existence was a threat to their cause. They needed to prove that her victories were not the work of God, but the work of the devil. And so, after months in custody, Joan of Arc was brought to Rouen, the English administrative capital in occupied Normandy. Beginning in January 1431, she was put on trial. But this was not a trial for justice. It was an ecclesiastical show trial designed to find her guilty of heresy. By branding her a heretic, the English sought to retroactively invalidate the coronation of King Charles VII, proving that he had been crowned with the help of a witch. The trial was a sham from the start. It was orchestrated by the English but carried out by a panel of pro-English French clergy, led by a ruthless bishop named Pierre Cauchon. Joan, now 19 years old, was held in a secular prison, guarded by male English soldiers, which was a direct violation of church law for a female prisoner facing a religious court. She was denied any legal counsel, was repeatedly threatened with torture, and was interrogated for hours at a time, day after day. Yet, despite all of this, the illiterate peasant girl defended herself with remarkable intelligence and composure. She was questioned relentlessly about her visions, her faith, and her habit of wearing men's clothing, an act the court considered unnatural and heretical. But Joan remained firm. She insisted her voices came from God and that she was a faithful daughter of the church. At one point, when the judges tried to trap her by asking if she knew she was in God's grace, she gave a legendary answer: "If I am not, may God place me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a response so brilliant, so perfectly humble and faithful, that it stunned her accusers into silence. But the outcome was never truly in question. This court was not interested in the truth. It was a political machine designed for one purpose: to crush a symbol. Her trial was not a battle of wits, it was a battle of the soul of France, and her enemies had stacked the deck against her. So, our 19-year-old peasant girl has spent months in a cold cell, defending her life and her faith against some of the most powerful men in France. She has shown intelligence, courage, and an unshakable conviction that has baffled her accusers. But this was never a trial about truth. It was a political assassination disguised as a legal proceeding. The outcome was never in question. The judges, led by Bishop Pierre Cochon, were determined to find her guilty. In the end, after all the interrogations and threats, Joan was condemned for heresy. The final verdict was based largely on 2 points: her refusal to renounce her divine voices and her insistence on wearing male clothing, which she'd resumed in her prison cell for protection against her male guards. For these crimes, the sentence was death. The girl who had lifted a nation would now be silenced, not by a sword in battle, but by a court of men determined to erase her from history. Or so they thought. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace in Rouen. A tall wooden stake had been erected. She was just 19 years old. As she was tied to the stake, the flames piled high around her. She reportedly called out the name of Jesus repeatedly. She asked for a cross to be held before her eyes so she could look upon it as she died. An English soldier, so moved by her courage and piety, quickly fashioned a small wooden cross from 2 pieces of stick and handed it to her. Witnesses said she faced her horrific death with a calm, unwavering resolve. Her execution was meant to be a final, public humiliation, a warning to any who would dare to follow her path. But it had the exact opposite effect. Instead of being erased, Joan was instantly transformed into a martyr. Even the English and Burgundian observers in the crowd were deeply disturbed by the spectacle. Some wept. Others openly questioned whether the church had just committed a grave and terrible injustice. One of the English secretaries present was famously said to have exclaimed, "We are lost, for we have burned a saint." In that moment, her enemies understood their catastrophic failure. They had killed a girl, but they had created a legend. Over the years that followed, Joan's image only grew stronger. Her unwavering faith, her courage in battle, and her dignified defence at trial became the foundation for a powerful national myth. In 1456, 25 years after her death, a formal investigation ordered by the Pope officially declared her trial invalid. She was exonerated of all charges, her name cleared of heresy. In the centuries that followed, Joan of Arc became a unifying symbol for France. During times of a national crisis, her story was invoked as a beacon of patriotism and divine mission. Artists, writers, and historians immortalized her life. And finally, in 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the Catholic Church, the very institution whose corrupt officials had condemned her, officially canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. The girl who was burned as a heretic was now one of its most revered figures. Her life defied every expectation. Peasant, prophet, warrior, prisoner, saint. Through an unshakable faith and an iron will, she altered the course of a kingdom. Through fire she entered legend, and through memory she lives on. And now, We leave the world of kings and saints, of epic battles and grand destinies. We travel to a different corner of the medieval world, a quieter, humbler, but no less essential place. We are going to a place of warmth, of labour that begins in darkness, and of a smell that has defined daily life for thousands of years. We are going to the world of the medieval baker. All right, we've left the world of kings and saints, of epic battles and grand destinies. We're now in a quieter, humbler, but no less essential corner of the medieval world. The life of a medieval baker began in darkness. Long before the first rooster crowed or the church bells tolled for morning prayer, bakers were already hard at work. Their day often started around midnight, when the rest of the town was fast asleep. The streets were cold and still, but inside the bake shop, a fire was already crackling. Flour dust hung in the air like a ghostly fog, and the ancient rhythm of kneading had begun. Medieval bread wasn't something you just whipped up. It required precise timing, a practiced hand, and a very needy roommate, the sourdough starter. There were no convenient packets of commercial yeast. Bakers relied on these carefully nurtured living blobs of fermenting dough to give rise and flavour to their loaves. This starter was a temperamental beast, a living entity that had to be fed and cared for daily. Forgetting to tend to it didn't just mean a bad batch of bread, it could mean the death of your livelihood. The flour itself was often coarse, ground at the local mill, and its quality could change with the seasons. In lean times, bakers would stretch their precious flour supplies by mixing in bran, barley, or even ground-up beans. The water was hauled in heavy buckets from the town well. Everything was measured and mixed by hand, usually in the dim, flickering light of an oil lamp. The kneading trough was a massive wooden basin, and the dough had to be worked relentlessly until it reached the perfect texture, a task that required brute strength and endless repetition. The art of any bakery, however, was the oven. These were typically massive dome-shaped structures made of clay or brick, designed to retain incredible heat for hours. Heating one wasn't a quick process. The baker would burn bundles of wood inside until the walls glowed, radiating a heat so intense you could feel it from across the room. Then, the embers and ashes were carefully raked out, the oven floor was wiped clean with a damp cloth, and the loaves were loaded in using a peel, a long-handled wooden paddle that let bakers slide bread deep into the fiery chamber without hopefully losing their eyebrows. By the time the rest of the town began to stir, the baker's first loaves were already out of the oven, their crusts golden and singing. The smell of warm bread would fill the air, the true scent of daily survival. But in the medieval world, bread was more than just food. It was the foundation of every meal, and, more importantly, a clear and obvious marker of your social class. What you ate for breakfast said a great deal about who you were. At the very top of the food chain, you had manchet, or white bread. This was the aristocrat of the bread world, soft, pale, and ridiculously expensive. It was made from the finest, most heavily sifted wheat flour. All the coarse, nutritious bran was removed, a labour-intensive process that drove up the cost. This was the bread of nobles, high-ranking clergy and wealthy merchants. It was a status symbol that basically announced, I am so rich, I can afford to eat food that has had all the nutrition painstakingly removed from it. For the growing middle class, the townsfolk, tradesmen and artisans, the standard was revel, or wheaten bread. Still made from wheat, it was less refined than manchet, slightly darker and more nutritious. It was the solid, respectable bread of the working professional. In many towns, laws dictated the exact weight and price of this bread to prevent bakers from ripping off the hungry masses. And then, for the vast majority of the population, the poor, the labourers, the peasants, there was maslin, or black bread. This was a dense, coarse, and often bitter loaf made from a mix of whatever grains were cheap and available: rye, barley, oats. In hard times, bakers might even stretch the dough with ground beans, peas, or chestnut flour. It was filling, yes, but it was also a constant, edible reminder of your low place in society. Bread was even used as a social tool at feasts. Wealthy lords would use thick slices of stale bread, called trenchers, as plates to hold their meat and sauces. After the meal was over, these gravy-soaked bread plates were not thrown away. They were either eaten by the servants or given as charity to the poor who waited at the castle gates. Imagine being so poor that your dinner is literally someone else's plate. A skilled baker had to navigate this edible class system every single day. They didn't just bake one type of loaf. They produced multiple varieties to meet the needs of the entire town, from the lord in his castle to the beggar on the street. Bread wasn't just nourishment. It was economy, hierarchy, and identity, baked into every single crust. So, our medieval baker has survived the pre-dawn darkness and navigated the edible class system of his town. He is a master of his craft. But being a baker in medieval Europe wasn't just a matter of skill. It was a matter of law. Bread was so essential to life that its production was heavily, and I mean heavily, regulated by local authorities and trade guilds. Failing to follow the rules didn't just mean a bad review. It could mean public humiliation, losing your entire livelihood, or even getting kicked out of town. In most towns, the baking profession was controlled by guilds. Think of them as a combination of a trade union, a quality control agency, and a low-stakes mafia. These guilds established strict standards for the weight, size, and ingredients of the bread, and these weren't optional guidelines. They were enforced through regular surprise inspections. Officials known as bread weighers or ale tasters could show up at your bake shop at any time to check your loaves. Imagine the stress. You're in the middle of a chaotic morning rush, and suddenly the bread police are at your door ready to weigh your wares and your soul. If a baker was caught selling underweight loaves, a practice known as short-changing, or using shoddy ingredients, the punishments could be wonderfully dramatic. Some bakers were put in the pillory, locked into public stocks where the angry townsfolk could mock them and pelt them with their own substandard, undersized bread. Others were forced to parade through town with the offending loaves strung around their necks like a necklace of shame. In extreme cases, a repeat offender could be banned from the trade or exiled from the town altogether. These rules weren't just about fairness, they were about preventing riots. Bread was the staple food, and town leaders knew that if people suspected they were being cheated out of their daily bread, things could get very ugly, very quickly. For the medieval baker, precision wasn't just a point of pride, it was a legal obligation. But the law wasn't the only thing that could kill you. Running a medieval bake shop was a genuinely dangerous business. The number one threat was, you guessed it, fire. Your entire job revolved around maintaining a roaring inferno inside a massive brick oven, often in an enclosed space made of timber and thatch, located in a densely packed town where buildings were basically kindling. A single stray ember, a moment of carelessness, and your bake shop, and possibly the entire neighbourhood, could go up in flames. For this reason, many towns required bake shops to be located on the outskirts. Beyond the constant threat of a fiery death, there were the long-term health risks. Prolonged exposure to the intense heat and smoke took a heavy toll on the lungs and skin. The heavy lifting of flour sacks and the endless repetitive motion of kneading dough wore down the body over time, and of course, burns were a constant companion. Scars on the arms, hands, and face earned while loading and unloading hot loaves from the oven's fiery mouth. Now, while the official image of the medieval baker is often of a man in a flour-dusted apron, a huge and critical role was played by women. Their contribution has often been overlooked by history, but they were essential to keeping the ovens hot and the population fed. In many rural areas and villages, women were the primary bakers, baking for their own families in small hearths or communal ovens. Many also sold their surplus loaves at the local market, giving them a rare source of independent income in a world dominated by men. In the cities, the guilds were usually male-dominated, but not always. Widows of bakers were often permitted to continue their husband's business, and some became successful and respected bakery owners in their own right. They performed the same grueling work as men, mixing dough in massive troughs, hauling water, managing the oven's temperamental heat, and selling the bread. Many also worked as bread sellers, walking the streets with heavy baskets balanced on their heads. Despite their essential labour, women were often paid less, received less recognition, and were more vulnerable to accusations of cheating. Still, their contribution was vital. During times of war or plague when men were absent, it was often the women who sustained the entire community's food supply. In every corner of medieval society, women shaped the world through bread. Though history often left them unnamed, their hands were among the first to touch the dough that would nourish entire towns. Alright, so our medieval bakers navigated the class system, the guilds, the daily dangers, and the unsung heroism of his profession. But his life was shaped by two final, inescapable forces that governed every aspect of medieval society: the church and the powers that be. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was sacred, and few institutions influenced baking more than the church. It was both a massive consumer and the ultimate spiritual authority on the subject. At the heart of this connection was the Eucharist, the Christian rite where bread was believed to become the body of Christ. The preparation of this specific bread, the host, was subject to incredibly strict guidelines. Only the finest, purest white wheat flour could be used, and it had to be unleavened. In monasteries, specific monks were assigned this holy duty, baking in silence in special ovens, stamping each wafer with a sacred symbol. But the church's relationship with bread went far beyond ritual. Monasteries were some of the largest landowners and food producers in Europe. Many ran their own industrial-scale bake shops, producing huge amounts of bread for the monks, their workers, and their guests. For the poor, monasteries were also lifelines, distributing alms bread to the beggars and travellers who waited at the gates. On religious feast days, bakers would create special, rich, spiced loaves, shaped into crosses or doves, marking the rhythm of the year with celebratory bread. In the medieval imagination, bread wasn't just sustenance, it was spiritual nourishment. But if the church represented spiritual power, the local lord or king represented a far more immediate kind of authority. In the medieval world, bread was deeply, deeply political. For rulers, mayors, and kings, controlling the price and supply of bread was just as important as maintaining an army. Because bread was the staple food for most of the population, its availability was directly linked to political stability. This led to intense price controls. In places like England, the assize of bread and ale was a law that tied the price of a loaf to the current cost of grain. If a bad harvest or a war caused grain prices to skyrocket, bakers couldn't just raise their prices. Instead, they were legally required to make their loaves smaller. Imagine if the price of a coffee never changed, but during a bean shortage, your cup just got smaller and sadder every week. That was the medieval baker's reality. This system was designed to prevent bakers from exploiting the hungry, but it also put them in a tough spot. Bread riots were a very real and very terrifying threat. When bread became scarce or unaffordable, angry mobs could form in an instant. Bakers were often the first to be accused of hoarding flour or cheating customers. Entire shops could be looted. To maintain peace, city officials would sometimes seize grain stocks or subsidize bread prices. The humble baker stood right at the volatile intersection of hunger and authority. And so we come to the end of our baker's story. Though rarely named in chronicles or praised in songs, the medieval baker left behind a legacy that shaped the very foundation of everyday life. In a world of castles, cathedrals and kings, it was the baker who fed the people. Their skills were passed down through generations. How to read the oven's heat without a thermometer, how to feel when the dough was just right. Over time, the baker's role evolved. Windmills and watermills improved flour production, and commercial bakeries became more common. But the essential rhythm of the work remained the same. Rise, knead, shape, fire, feed. It was a cycle as old as civilization itself. Even our modern world carries the echoes of their work. The word companion comes from the Latin companis, meaning with bread, someone you share your bread with. The guilds that once regulated bakers paved the way for modern food safety standards, and the communal ovens of medieval villages laid the foundation for today's neighbourhood bakeries. In the end, the medieval baker's legacy is not just in the loaves they made, but in the sustained life of a community. Through flour, fire and faith, they didn't just feed bodies. They nourished entire societies, and with that, our long journey through the hidden corners of history comes to an end. We started in the hazy, lotus-scented banquet halls of ancient Egypt and witnessed their divine parties. We walked the merciless battlefields of the Viking North and learned of the magic in their weeds. We saw the impossible, deadly standards of beauty in Renaissance Florence. We stood beside a young girl named Joan as she crowned a king and was burned as a saint. We followed a Roman woman through the chaotic, unforgiving streets of the capital. And finally, we stood in the pre-dawn warmth of a medieval bake shop. In each world, we looked past the grand narratives of kings and battles to find the human story, the details, the struggles, the strange and wonderful ways people have always found to survive, to celebrate, to believe, and to endure. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope these stories have been an interesting companion, and until next time, rest well.